All right, good morning. As we work through our 2014 rhetorical analysis, one part of our notes that is indispensable, I would recommend, would be our integrating quotations notes. And you can just go on to Classroom and dig that up. They were posted in, I believe, September. And that's a lot of valuable review. But I thought because we're hanging out anyway, um, I would just go over the basics regarding integrating quotations that you would use for support in any type of argumentative or analytical writing. So we're going to start with some of the real basic stuff. Um, First thing I would say, and this is just a general piece of advice, use the smallest part of the quotation of the quoted material that you can get away with. There's nothing to gain from using a really long quote. In the parameters of what we're doing this year, which is relatively small analytical writing assignments, you're not going to do block quotes, and you're not going to want a very lengthy quote. At best, it's going to probably confuse your audience, and it's going to kind of take away from the main cogent argument that you're trying to make. It's going to camouflage, it's going to dilute a lot of what your persuasive inertia really is by just including long, meandering quotations from other people. It's going to take away from the forcefulness of your writing. It's going to distract, and it's not going to probably benefit your main argument. And that's at best. At worst, you look intellectually lazy. It's kind of like, an eighth or ninth grader might say, well, the longer my quote, the less I have to write. So I'll write a 3-page essay, but I'll fill it with these big long quotes. And in the end, I didn't have to do much original or independent thinking. I know that sounds kind of like juvenile and maybe pathetic, but that does happen. So anyway, you want to use the smallest amount of a quote that does the job, that still performs what the function of the quote is meant to do. Probably making a sharpening of a point that you're trying to throw out there, or again, just trying to illustrate or highlight what it is you're talking about in terms of your evidence, or you trying to articulate your finer argument. So there's another rule of thumb. For every line of a quotation, you want to write 2 to 3 lines of analysis about that. So if you have a 2-line quote, you should be writing at least 4, 5, possibly 6 lines about it. If you use a quotation and you say to yourself, well, I don't have a lot to say about it, you probably shouldn't use that quotation, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have me, your teacher, saying you have to use quotations. You have to refer to specific evidence. And so I get it. You have to do it. But remember what the point of this is. You're trying to support an argument. Your quotations are evidence. And so if your quotation doesn't offer itself to analysis, if you don't have anything to say about your quote, then it's really not a quote. You're just throwing something in there. It's not valuable. So that would be just the way to get started here. Use the smallest amount of a quote you can, and think about every line of a quote. You're writing 2 or 3 lines about that, okay? And ultimately, like I said, we do not want long quotations. You don't want someone else's writing to dominate your essay, all right? Remember, the quotations have a secondary or supplemental function. They're trying to support your main argument, but you're not hiding behind them, and you're not letting them dominate the writing in your essay. Okay? All right. All right. So getting down to it, there are 3 basic ways to integrate quotes that I'll just kind of go over quickly today. And the first would be to introduce the quotation with a complete sentence. And when you do that, you use a colon. Okay? So Mr. Kaleo made his point. Well, that's an actual sentence. It's not a long one, but that's a complete sentence. And then we have a colon, right? Always integrate your quotations, unquote. The author clearly asks her most important question in the 3rd paragraph. So that is a complete sentence. We have a colon, and then we have our quotation. Okay? Um, that's a great way of really establishing a solid introductory phrase, because when you use a complete sentence, well, you're conveying more information, right? And what should go into the introductory phrase of a quote? Well, it really depends on what you're using the quote for and the context of using that quote. So it's not like there's one list of things, right? Every time you introduce a quote, you have to do A, B, C, and D. It doesn't really work that way because again, it's quite fluid. It just depends on why you're using the quote and what the context is. But I think a safe assumption would be identify the writer or the speaker, right? I mean, who is saying this quote? Who is writing this quote? I think that's a given. So you have to always identify the person who created the quote, right, that you're borrowing from. And then it becomes, what's your purpose? All right. Very often, the context of the quote, the background information, why is the author or why is the person, why are you using the quote? Right? That might often go into the introductory phrase. So the speaker, the situation, the purpose of the use of that quote, those are things. But anyway, so when you use a complete sentence to introduce a quote, you just have a lot of room to put those introductory pieces of information in there. All right. And when you do that, of course, you would use a colon. Okay. Are you going to do this all the time? No, because you really can't maneuver in and out of these quotes too gracefully, right? I mean, to set up a quote with a complete sentence, there definitely is a time and place to do it, but you don't want to do that all the time because, again, it gets awkward. It's a little bit of heavy lifting, okay? So in actuality, another common way to introduce a quote instead of a complete sentence with a colon would be to use, well, a phrase, right? Dependent clause, not a complete sentence. So use an introductory or explanatory phrase, but not a complete sentence, separated from the quotation with a comma. And these are very common, right? John asked, comma, why does this matter? The lawyer's greatest concern, and I should have put an apostrophe S there, but don't judge, was, comma, quote, will there be a trial? The mysterious critic alleged, quote, there is no point in hiding the crime. So here you're not using a complete sentence to introduce a quote, but you don't always have to. Often when you've already kind of introduced some of the background information of that quote, then it doesn't require a lengthy context for each fragment of a quotation that you're going to use. And other times, the meaning or the use of that quote or the background of that quote might be just self-explanatory. It might be obvious. It just depends on how you're building your argument. So these are very, very common. And again, you're just using a comma to kind of get that going. All right. The third way, and this is what I would honestly suggest. I mean, listen, there's all types of ways to do this, but you want to get comfortable enough when you're integrating quotations to not really have to stop everything and say, okay, now I'm putting down a quote. You want to kind of integrate these fluidly and fluently into your argument. So it's almost like you're blending in and blending out of someone else's language in order to make your point. So this is what you want to try to strive for. Make the quotation a part of your own sentence without any punctuation between your own words and the words you are quoting. When considering what the author refers to as a grave injustice, we must move past what Dr. Schroeder considers systemic failure of our justice system and reflect on the facts. So this also supports, remember the philosophy at the beginning of this little lecture here, that you don't want to use very long quotes. You want to kind of sharpen or pinpoint exactly what you're referring to from evidence, but you want to, like I said, just kind of drop these little jewels into your main argument, right? You don't want to hide behind someone else's point of view entirely. You don't want to try to, just kind of throw someone else's ideas out there and say, I agree with these. You want to make your own original independent argument, but you want to fortify it with these pieces of someone else's language that for whatever reason you're using them, they either articulate or they really refine or they just clarify or support what it is you're trying to throw out there. And this is a great way to do that. So again, you might be using just fragments, just small little phrases, sometimes one word to just kind of sharpen or really put a nice edge on your meaning. Okay, and another note, right, if you use the word that or as, you really do not need a comma. The mysterious critic alleged that there is no point in hiding the crime. So at the risk of being repetitive, I've said from the beginning of the year, there are certain reporting verbs. A reporting verb is a verb you would use to pretty much, introduce a quote, right? You're letting me know how the author conveyed that meaning. How did they convey their quote? So one of the things I always basically said to avoid was says. the author says, the author states, the author writes. I'm not saying you can never use those, but they're really not effective because they're just too broad, right? They could mean anything. So there are certain ways that you want to try to be more specific when you integrate your quotes. All right. This is just an example of some, right? These are neutral. In other words, these don't really necessarily, are they really strong? Not really. Are they necessarily tentative? Are they? No, they're just kind of there, right? They're kind of formal. Um, the author describes, the author reveals, the author shows, the author demonstrates, the author goes on to say that, the author reports. These are more, I guess you could say, objective. They're neutral, right? There's no particular hidden type of bias in them. But notice that we don't have says really. We don't have rights, right? These are just more specific based on the reason why you're integrating these quotes. Tentative, kind of means uncertain, right? There's a certain degree of I don't know, doubt, or there's not 100% confidence, perhaps, in what's being conveyed. So we have words like suggest, or speculates, or intimates, hypothesizes, or implies. All right. So if you're recruiting a quotation from an author, but you want to make it clear that the quote itself is not 100% certain, then you would use a more tentative reporting verb, right? And finally, if you have a real strong quote that you feel that you want the audience to know that the author is very adamant or very definitive about, then you might use a more concrete or strong reporting verb. Argue, claims, emphasizes. Okay, so no big deal, people. This is all fairly obvious, but I know we have a propensity towards sometimes falling back on says and I know, listen, timed writing, you might just have to. I mean, you might be thinking so many different, in so many different directions, and you might really be kind of under the gun, really trying to perform. And so you might recruit some, says. It's not the end of the world, but I want you to realize that, the more you think about this, the more inclined you are to elevate your verbiage, and that's going to strengthen your argument without a doubt. So finally, people, what is the takeaway here? Well, aside from the technical points, I would just kind of say, check your notes on Google Classroom, review this stuff, right? But, you always want to introduce a quote, okay? You want to have some sort of introductory phrase, even if it just identifies the speaker, all right? When you're supporting, your argument, such as in a rhetorical analysis, which it looks like that's what the AP exam is going to be, you want to use frequent quotes, but not lengthy quotes, right? You don't want, hey, every body paragraph I include one little quote. No, you really want to checker your body paragraphs with quotations. You want frequent reference to specific evidence, but you don't want each quote to be very, very long, right? And that's pretty much what I would take away, in the big picture. All right, people. So I'll be reaching out to you, I believe, tomorrow, right? We're going to have our little Google Meet where I don't think it's going to be very long. I'm just going to touch base with whoever can join us and answer any questions I can regarding anything, all right, that I can help you with. All right, people. Take care.